And so to be forced basically to shed like Inanna is a really scary thing to do, but it is an archetypal kind of rite of passage that we go through over and over and over again in our lives, I would say.
Yeah.
Welcome to Soror Mystica, a podcast exploring life's mysteries and magic through its symbols.
I'm Mariana Lewis, an archetypal tarotist.
And I'm astrologer Christina Farella.
And just as the Soror Mystica guided the alchemist through his holy work, we hope to be your mystic sisters in these conversations, guiding you deeper into the symbolic life. Hello, everyone. I wanted to let you know about a new sponsor that we have before we jump into the podcast today, which is the Jung Academy, which I am a faculty member of. Jung Academy has sponsored this podcast before, but I wanted to let you know about the classes that are coming up for them. So if you haven't heard of the Jung Academy before, they are an online educational platform in which they continue the tradition of Jungian psychology. So coming up right now on their docket for the spring is the Interpreting Fairy Tales of the Goose Girl, as well as Jung and Contemporary Art, and Synchronicity and the Goddess of Meaning. So if any of these things sound extremely interesting to you or spark some kind of curiosity, as they do me just reading the titles of these classes, please check out jungarcademy.com and see what other offerings they have. They also have, in addition to their live classes, video courses for you to watch on demand. So absolutely go check out jungarcademy.com. Everybody, welcome to the 45th episode of Soror Mystica. Today, our focus is all about eclipses and what they mean for us in the stars, in the sky, as well as what they mean for us psychologically and spiritually. So we're gonna be in the path of descent today. So before we jump into that, how are you doing, Christina?
I'm good. I'm here. I'm getting over a cold, so I feel like
I haven't asked you about that in a couple of days.
How dare you?
I forgot.
It's okay. It's
Forgot
not
that you had a
interesting.
cold.
I had a cold, everyone, and I survived, but I still sound a little bit snurgly. So this is my,
Good word.
I think that my mom says that. So that is how I feel, but I'm good. I'm good. And I'm happy to be recording with you, Mariana. We've been spacing out our podcast drops because other things are happening, but it's really nice to just be rejoining. And it's also, obviously at the time of recording this and while this is coming out, we're in the eclipse portal. So it's a very, very tender time in the cosmos, and I'm excited to kind of open this up today.
So we always start with what are you reading? Are you reading anything right now?
I'm reading so many things. Actually, in the mornings, I'm just reading like one chunk of a chapter at a time of The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Yeah,
So
good.
like actually sitting with that instead of just like reading scraps of it.
What the internet says about it.
Yeah. Well,
Just
not even
different.
that. I think I've like picked it up so many times and
Yeah.
I'm just like looking for something else and I'll read, a few paragraphs and been like, oh my God, this is so great.
Yeah.
So I'm actually working my way through it, which is really great. And then I'm also reading a fiction book called On the Marble Cliffs by Ernst Junger. And it is a book that came out, I think it came out in like I want to say the 50s. But it's really interesting, actually. It reminds me a lot of Till We Have Faces. It's kind of a fantasy book, but it's also about like the rise of fascism, but it's set in like an enchanted forest, and it's like two monks living in, they're like herbalist monks living in the woods. And
That sounds like for me.
It's very, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you about it. So I'm midway through it. It's interesting. There's no dialogue. It's all description, but the writing is really beautiful. And it just feels like an appropriate read for our cool fascistic times. So
Great.
it's definitely, once I get through it, I definitely am going to write about it a little bit because it's very beautiful.
As long as it's not like Animal Farm, because I can't take it.
I don't think it's like Animal Farm, but
God.
I don't know what's going to happen to these monks. I'm a little worried about them. They don't seem to have a lot of good instincts about what's happening.
Monks don't. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I read Here's a Thousand Faces a long time ago because my grandpa, that was one of the books he had in
Mm-hmm.
his library. So I don't think I was in high school. I think I was in college, but I remember reading it being like, what? Huh? He's a lot of Joseph Campbell as a writer tries to be a lot more like factual sciencey than he is as a speaker. As a
Mm-hmm.
speaker, he's very inspiring. As a writer, he's trying to be academic, but then he says a lot of things in a lot of ways that you're like, what does that mean?
Mhm. I know. It's
um,
very beautiful. I'm like
yeah,
very impressed by the writing.
yeah,
So,
no, he is a very good. He's just good with language in general. So I would
mhm.
love to read that one again and like see if I can wrap. I mean, I read it the first time and I got it, but like I want to like get
You would
the
get so
deeper
much
thing.
more out of it now,
Yeah,
considering everything else that you
it's
know
been a
so
long
well.
time.
So it's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I feel like I'm reading it at the right time. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I've never picked it up with like it's sticking
Yeah.
because I had to learn a lot of other things first.
Yep.
And that's a good point about reading books, everyone, is that sometimes we want to read something and it's just not the right moment. And
Yeah, you're
then
just not ready for it.
eventually you
Mm-hmm.
are.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and it doesn't mean you're not smart enough. It might just not hit the right way.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I am reading. So I just finished the novel "I Who Have Never Known Men" by Jacqueline
Mhm.
Hartman, who it's originally in a French language novel, and it's written in the 70s, I think, and it's like a post-apocalyptic thing, but it's like basically the premise is that there's these 40 women who live in a bunker. They don't know why they're there, how they got there. And then they are just trying to like, they end up like leaving this bunker early on in the book because of a accident or like a crazy stroke of luck. And then they just are trying to figure out where the hell they are. Are they on Earth? Why were they in this bunker? Why were they not allowed to touch each other? Like they don't have any of these answers. So it was like a very interesting exploration on mystery and holding the mystery and not getting answers, and also like exploring the experiences of the mind outside of culture and society. So I found it because I was like on Instagram and they were like, do you like Severance? You'll like this book.
Hmm.
And Severance is, it's a great show. So I was like, okay, why not? And it was really good and really stimulating intellectually. And the main character is the Page of Swords embodied.
Hmm.
It was such a good example of what the Page of Swords is at its core, and all this like intellectual stimulation, but like not knowing what to do with it, and really good. And
That's so
then,
cool.
yeah, a really interesting book, though very frustrating for people who like answers. It's not the one for you.
Mm.
You have to, you don't get a lot. And then I also just started reading The Soul's Code by James Hillman,
Oh yeah, I've
which
been meaning to read that
I
forever
think you would really
too.
like it.
Yeah,
Actually, I've avoided a little bit because it's like his pop
yeah.
psychology book. So I was like, like I can do better things with him.
Hmm.
But then I was like, screw it. Like this is
Oh
probably going to
yeah.
be accessible and like
Hmm.
not be over dense. And so I'm only, I don't know, 50 pages in or so. But it is it is all about the daemon so far, and it's about restoring integrity to psychology, which is basically restoring the soul to psychology, because psychology tries to talk about everything but the soul, even though what its subject is the soul. So his argument is essentially that we can re-ensoul, like he doesn't even like the word psychology, but our thinking of the psyche and self. In fact, he says that he's not even going to use the word self. He said, I will not use the word self or experience or any of these nonsense words. He's very cranky. Um, but yeah, he talks a lot about the daemon and these older concepts of this guiding soul figure that leads us to the innate, like almost like teleological destiny that we have as individuals. So it seems like it's gonna be really good, even though he's a very like intense writer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he is, but I think that it's worth it. And I mean, I love The Dream in the Underworld a
Mm-hmm.
lot, and that's like kind of abstract, I guess you could say, a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. It's like more intense
Yeah,
and
it is.
also a thought experiment. So Yeah, it's like whenever I find a good Hillman quote, it's always from Soul's Code, and I'm like, I should read that.
I think you would really, because I know how much you've thought about the daemon.
Yeah.
You've done research on that. So I think this is more of a, like, I know about it, but I haven't like really sat with that concept before. So I think you would really enjoy it. So you can have my copy when it's done, but I accidentally spilled salad dressing on it. So
I will accept your salad dressing book.
it'll
It's
smell
okay.
like lemon and basil, but
I think that sounds good.
it's okay.
Along the mystery thing, the mystery line of the other book that you were reading, have you ever read or seen the movie Picnic at Hanging Rock?
I might have. What is it about?
So it's a novel. The novel is from the 60s, and then they made a movie in the 70s, and I've seen the movie. And it's about a bunch of schoolgirls in Australia. They go out for lunch one day into the kind of like, wilds of Australia to some sort of like ancient, basically like ruins, like rock ruins.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've seen it.
And two of them disappear, and they try to figure out what happened for the rest of the book. And it's pretty much like, without giving it away, it's like it's an unanswerable question.
Yeah.
And it's just like a very strange environment. And so, yeah, the movie is very pretty. Maybe it would be good to watch, but it's really, really unique and really strange. And it's just kind of one of those films that's like a curiosity, I would say.
I was telling my husband about the plot of this book, that I Who Have Never Known Men, and he got so agitated just listening to me talk about it. He was like, "Why did you even tell me about this?" Because because he's the type that needs the conclusion, like having the open-ended
then you can't
thing.
Watch Picnic at Hanging Rock.
I'll have to watch it alone. Yeah. He cannot deal with it. So it's hard. I think it requires an extraordinary ability to be with the intuitive function, to hold mystery. He's a very sensation type. It's like, I need it to be in front of me and I need it to make sense. But the intuitive side is like, wow, mystery. Let's go after it. Let's be enchanted by it. So, it's a different thing. But that's so funny. I'm going to definitely add it to my list. I love that.
Yeah, it's great.
Cool. All right. So let's jump into eclipses. So today is an eclipse that we're recording this, and then we have another one coming up. So you have a lot of information for us about the nature of eclipses.
Yeah, without, turning this into like an astro forecast, because I don't know. Well, people probably would be into it, because I think a lot of people who listen are into
people
astrology.
Don't know what's going on. Some people listening right now know a lot, and most people don't know anything. So you can give us whatever information you think is useful. So
basically, eclipses are events that happen about 4 times a year, sometimes more, sometimes less, where due to the position of the sun, the moon, and the earth, either the sun or the moon has like a shadow cast over it or is blocked from our view. And so, the eclipses are either, we see the eclipses when they're full moons. That's when the moon looks like it's red. And then solar eclipses are when, the earth is like crossing in front of the shadow of the earth in front of the sun. Anyway, thinking about what that means symbolically for us, these are really charged lunar events, solar lunar events, because the sun and the moon are the kind of foundation of all energy flowing in the cosmos. Yeah. They're the foundation of what makes day and night, what gives us life here on Earth, right? We need the sun and moon to function. And so eclipses have always existed because they're an astronomical event that's very normal. But to ancient people, eclipses looked like they were like totally just demonic. Like imagine you're like an ancient person out for a walk at night, and it's a peaceful full moon evening, and then suddenly the moon turns red. That probably doesn't bode very well for whatever you're hoping to like bring in for your harvest or your sheeps or whatever you're doing out there. So thinking about eclipses and astrology, or eclipses and astronomy, eclipses are kind of like the original bad omen that we have from the natural world. And so they seem to symbolize a kind of death or a kind of like stopping of life force. And so eclipses for us, magically, and for people that live in tune with the rhythms of nature, are times of kind of like surrender, turning inward, and turning towards shadow material temporarily, right? So it's kind of one of those moments on the path when we're not striving forward, we're looking within, similar to a retrograde, I
Yeah.
would say.
Which we
And
have an episode on, by the way, if you want to listen to that one too.
yes, and Mercury goes retrograde tomorrow.
Oh, great.
So we're in like this interesting kind of liminal space. So the eclipse that happened today was an eclipse at 23 degrees Virgo. It was a full moon eclipse, a lunar eclipse at 23 Virgo, activating the Virgo Pisces axis, which is the axis of healing or the axis of like magic versus the mundane. Pisces is magic, Virgo's the mundane. So there's a lot of stuff happening in like the realm of public service and, you know, the kind of ways that we are of service to our communities, aka like everyone in the federal government being fired and the whole world falling apart and us
Yeah.
not feeling very healthy, very healed, very well. As a result of that. So the collective is witnessing that. But for us all as people, you know, our own experiences with wellness, with the ways that we connect with our bodies, with our circadian rhythms, and how we serve other people is very much sort of like coming up, I would say. Um, and so what's funky about this eclipse is that yesterday the sun conjoined Saturn, and the sun is involved in this eclipse because it's a full moon. And so the sun conjunct Saturn is a rebirth of structure and responsibility. And then tomorrow, right, today we had the eclipse, and then tomorrow, Mercury, who is the planet that rules the eclipse, is going retrograde. So there's like this looking backwards moment again happening in the cosmos. Venus is also retrograde right now. So we have just like a lot, it's very mixed up, kind of disorganized time, but so much to reflect on. And so, you know, this eclipse also ties us back to an eclipse that we had on September 18th of 2024. And so whatever was coming up for you all, us all, around then is now also kind of on the table again for reevaluation. That's how eclipses work. They sort of pull on each other symbolically and energetically. And so in a couple of weeks, on March 29th, the 29th, we're going to have our final eclipse in the Libra Aries eclipse series that's been happening for about 2 years. So we're closing a narrative around these themes of partnership and identity work, which is the Libra Aries axis, and we're kind of opening up into the healing, service, and, you know, magic axis of the collective with these two eclipses in March. So it's a big deal. Eclipses are super important. They can be very transformative. We can make big decisions around eclipses. We can find ourselves reaching for answers that are unfindable otherwise. We can receive messages, but we also don't have to like do too much in order to work with this energy. I always tell people don't try to do magic on the eclipse because the thing that runs magic is the light of the moon. And it is disrupted during eclipse time. So like no moon water, no divining, no whatever. You can light a candle if you want to, but just relax.
You can light a candle if you want.
If you really need to make yourself feel better, you can light a white candle, but you should just take a break and listen, right? And so I think what's so challenging about eclipse times is that it forces us to do that inward looking towards shadow and towards things that are kept in shadow that are really scary for us. And you know, using eclipses as a kind of jumping off point for our conversation today for things like the descent to the underworld, which is called katabasis, or just working with shadow in general. This is the time to kind of be tuning in. So I think that eclipses are a moment on the path of like, you know, this is when we have to turn in and down, and we will be coming back up again. It's not like we're just stuck here forever, but this is where we start today. So that's my eclipse info.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. It's very that idea of the katabasis is, you know, really powerful in mythologically because it's something it's a very, very important part, the main part of the story. Speaking of Joseph Campbell, he kind of breaks down the journey into like these three stages of like initiation, and then there's like the descent sort of phase, and then there's the return phase, and it's like these are the three stages we have to go in. The initiation In my looking at the tarot, I kind of think of the major arcana in that way. In that, well, and the minor arcana, but sort of differently. In that I look at the first like 6 cards of the, the magician through the lovers, and think of them kind of outside of that process as like these primordial figures that we're meeting in different
Mm.
capacities. Here's the archetypal mother, and here's the, the principle of eros and logos that we encounter and all that stuff. And then we really initiate that initiation begins with the chariot, and then we have this phase of initiation. Then with the hangman, we have the descent part of it, that katabasis. And then with the star, we begin the anabasis, which is that
Mm.
secondary part of the, at least it's Greek.
Mhm.
Katabasis and anabasis, that second part of that process to the Greeks. And I think that, it's I like to think of it that way because the cards really show us exactly how we go about that process. With that chariot, in that initiation, saying like, I have a purpose. I have a life I want to make. I have a sense of self, and then developing that as much as possible, and then the hangman being able to surrender it all. And those two figures look so similar. The charioteer and the hangman, they're like the same person. They
Mm.
look like the same person. I do not think that's an accident
Mhm.
on Pamela Smith's part.
Mhm.
It looks, there's this moment where we get strung up. We don't know, we don't have our footing anymore. Things are eclipsed, right? And so that also points to that like retrograde idea we talked about the hangman in that episode. But then we go into this full descent, and we have to wrangle with that. And in that descent, we meet the devil, and we go through death, and we have the tower, and we have all these really, really challenging things. But that's the only passageway to the transcendent anabasis stage of return, in which we're like, okay, like I've learned something, really learned something, and I can make it mean something. So I think it's something that we all fear and revolt against. And we have a lot of bad internet information about why you should be terrified right now. But it's part of the process that cannot be skipped.
Mhm.
It's important. And that's one of the things I hate the most about the world right now. It's like things are bad, they're very bad, it's really awful, but also who are we to think that we'd get out of bad things?
I know. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
true, and I think that that's like why having a handle on just like mythic structures is very
Mm-hmm.
comforting because you can then recognize like, oh, we're in a moment of descent. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, it feels like the collective has been in this moment of descent for a really long time. So
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't wind up being too comforting, but sometimes it is good to be able to find yourself on a map, even if you know that you're like in a bad place, because
Yeah.
you can identify what's going on and just kind of be present for that part of the experience, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
a story that I like to talk about whenever I'm talking about this idea of the katabasis, or this like archetypal descent that we go on, is the story of Inanna,
Hmm.
who is a Sumerian, Babylonian, whatever you want to use, goddess, because all these goddesses were the same basic
Yeah.
idea with different names, etc. But Inanna was the great goddess. She was the queen of all. And there's some events that happen. Goes on. Something happens with her. Pandora just meowed at me because
I
I made
heard
eye contact with her. You heard her? She saw me make eye contact. Like,
you.
um, so something goes on with her husband, and for the events bring her to have to go down to the underworld. She's the queen of heaven, but her sister is the queen of the underworld. And so she goes, her sister's name is Aresh Kigal, and she goes to Aresh Kigal's gate of the underworld, and she says, okay, here I am, queen of heaven, queen of all, let me in, I need to talk to you. And Aresh Kigal has all the doors bolted against her. And they tell her that she is not permitted entry unless she divests herself of her raiments. So Inanna comes because she's queen of heaven, dressed in her crown and her scepter and her gold and her beads and her like all of these things that symbolize her power and her sovereignty and her majesty. And so Ereshkigal says, you can only come in if you take all of that stuff off. And so gate by gate, I forgot how many there are. I think 7. Gate by gate, each gate she takes off more of her vestments, her clothes. And then when she finally gets to the inner gate, she's standing there. She's completely naked. And she doesn't anticipate this. She doesn't know what's going to happen. But there's these judges that appear and they say, "You are on trial." And she is judged, and they judge her guilty of whatever it is that they accuse her of. And she is then killed on the spot for this crime. And of course, we know that her sister hates her. Like, this was a master plan of her sister's. And then, that's really that katabasis part of her story. And then there is, after that, the anabasis part where, she has like friends in her kingdom who are like, "Where's Inanna? She's taken a really long time to get back." And so, they have a whole like thing to rescue her and restore her. And then she ends up sending her husband to live in the underworld in her place because he was a jerk and got the whole thing started in the first place. Anyway, but this, I think it's really beautiful story because what we see symbolically in this, she goes to the door and she says, "Let me in." And her sister says, "Not unless you take all of that off. You can't come into this place with all of this stuff on you that tells you who you think you are, all of this self-identity that you've cloaked yourself in, all of these ego beliefs about your power and your vitality and your purpose and all these things. Very nice, very shining gold things, very pretty. Take all of that off. You can't come in here with any of that on." And so she has to, with each step, bear more of her essential self that is not cloaked in all of these things that she's built herself up to be. And I think, that's what these sort of moments with eclipses and the katabasis is challenging us to submit to, is can we shed ourselves of these beliefs about who we are and these powers that we thought we had and all these things to get, I mean, it's not saying that they're not there and we're not worthy of those things, but in order to really enter the underworld, symbolically enter that place of our deepest, darkest experience of self, where we have to like confront that, we have to shed all of this. Like, we can't take that with us. And I think that that's also what we see in the tarot, with the hangman and then the death card. And, it's like, it's the shedding away of these things before we can face that inner enemy. This is the shadow, right? And then once we face the shadow is also the light bringer. And it tells us truths that we didn't know before, which if we bring back, well, have that apotheosis, like that holy rise out of the darkness into light again, that anabasis thing. So I think that that's something that I like to stress whenever we're in these periods. It's shedding, but it's conscious shedding. It is a conscious taking off of the garments that we wear to cloak ourselves and hide ourselves and like comfort ourselves about what we think we're in control of and who we think we are. So that we have to be naked again.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's such a crazy story with so many complicated parts. And I do think it is 7 gates because everything is 7.
Yeah,
And,
I think so.
the idea of like shedding of the layers for the sake of shadow, it reminded me that also in Vedic astrology, the idea of the north and south node of the moon, which is the astrological thing that we use to track where eclipses happen. Like in your chart, the north and south node say, when you were born, eclipses were happening in these 2 signs that year. And so from the Vedic myths, the north and south node are actually figured as a dragon or a snake, usually a dragon that has, it's a disembodied dragon. And so the north node is represented as just like the head and jaws of the dragon that like breathes fire and consumes everything in its path. And then the south node is the tail of the dragon that kind of waves around and destroys everything that is in its midst. And it has no body. It has no like digestive tract, no spine, no feet, no anything like that. And so it's just this wild dragon archetype in the sky that it was punished basically for trying to steal I think like honey or ambrosia or something from the gods, and they put it up in the sky and split it in half. But the idea of like the snake that sheds its skin and the cyclic flux of growth and then death, it's all very lunar. And it's all very much a part of what we all have to do in order to feel, like we continue to grow. And so times of the lunar cycle too, that are about wax and wane beyond eclipses, feel very much to me almost like Inanna going down to the depths is like the waning moon cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
then the death at the end of that experience is the new moon when the moon
Yeah.
disappears. And then eventually she gets pulled back up again. It's really potent. And it's just one of those things where if you start kind of poking on these stories, you start realizing that there's an analog for this experience in nature and then in so many myths and so many ways of making sense of the world that we've always had. So it really is a good argument, makes the case for why this work is so important, I
Mm-hmm.
think,
Yeah.
that's an aside. But yeah, I think that the shedding aspect
Mm-hmm.
is so important, and nobody really wants to shed. Like when I talk to my clients about, Pluto in the chart, or the experience of having the south node move over a part of their chart, over their ascendant, over a planet. We talk about letting go and shedding, and nobody really wants to do that. Everyone wants
Yeah,
to have a
everyone's like,
stable
yeah,
sense of
yeah, yeah,
self.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We have that. We've cultivated a stable sense of self for a reason, so that we can feel sane and like we know who we are and what's going on. And so to be forced basically to shed like Inanna is a really scary thing to do, but it is an archetypal kind of rite of passage that we
Yeah.
go through over and over and over again in our
Mm-hmm.
lives, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that Jung says is that the ego and shadow run parallel to each other.
Mm,
So the more that we build up the ego, the more that we build up the shadow.
hmm
And these two things run at the same course. So by that I mean like everything that we say we are and everything that we claim to be good in us or powerful in us or whatever, that means we have to reject something, some opposite experience. So I give the example sometimes of like, we say like, I am a really creative person and I'm really care about art and beauty and all this stuff, and that means that the more we lean into that as an ego self, the more that we have to reject the reality that we can be idle, that we can not know what we're doing sometimes, that we can produce stuff that's bad. And so when the shadow inevitably throws it back in our face and presents like we have a moment where it's like, all this beautiful creativity that I've had has been so great, and now there's nothing. Now it just is why like I'm zapped. I'm empty. The ego has, because the ego and shadow have been running parallel to each other, this part of us it's not gone away. It's not been like it's been there underneath the surface, and we will inevitably encounter it. And because the ego cannot let in the shadow without feeling like its self-identity is challenged or degraded or ruined in some way, it's going to resist that tooth and nail, right? This is like that classic thing of like, oh, I wrote a book. It was so amazing. Now I'm going to write my second book. I can't get anything on the page. And not only is that very frustrating, right? And it requires us to engage in a part of our shadow that we've completely pushed away, which is that sometimes you have to wait and not know what
hmm
you're doing and fumble a
hmm
little bit, right? It's part of it. But we feel like we've lost who we are. We don't know who we are anymore. It's like, but I was this. I was creative. I was productive. I was whatever. And so now I'm not, literally, and I cannot accept being not. So now there's this incredible contradiction in who we believed we were. And we are both, right? The idea is that we're both very creative and can produce amazing things. And we can have periods where we can't create anything and are totally zapped of inspiration and have no power to do that thing that we could do before. And that's just a natural part of the process. And so I think that, this is a really important thing, is talking about undressing, is this ability to be flexible, which is incredibly difficult. It's like probably the most difficult thing that we could be is flexible in our understanding of self and receptive to illumination of what the shadow has to tell us and say, okay, I accept that. And so, you and I both see clients all the time who are like, I one time had this lady come, oh my God, she came, she came to me and she was like, I don't remember what her diagnosis was, but she had gotten some kind of diagnosis that was like not a life-threatening thing, but it's very frustrating. It would require a lot of like care of herself, and she couldn't do as much as she wanted to do because of this diagnosis. Really upsetting. Very, very, of course. And in this reading, I pulled the hangman for her. And she had come to the reading because she was like, okay, I got this diagnosis and I want to make peace with it. That's what I want. I was like, okay, great. And so I pulled the hangman for her and I was like, the hangman says to accept this thing, right? It says that you have no control over it. There's no way that you can wrestle it to the ground and change your circumstance. The idea is to sacrifice your sense of this is what I thought my life was going to be for wherever it's now meant to go, for a deeper experience of selfhood, a deeper connection with what's meaningful in you. And it's very uncomfortable. It's not cool. I wish I had a better card for you. I wish the chariot came up and was like, power through, girl. But it's not. This is the thing. And she got really mad. And she was like, I pulled this card so many damn times and I'm sick of this message. I'm so sick of it because I am stuck in this condition. It really sucks. It limits my life. And I want to be done with it already. And I was like, yeah, of course you do. Like there's no shame in that. There's no, like, that is the fairest thing for you to desire, is to be out of the challenge, out of the thing. And yet, as the tarot apparently has been telling you over and over and pulling this card so many times, and now has come up in our reading, that is not that's not the opportunity right now. It's not to move on. And so there is this ability to like be with the shedding, like be flexible to it. That means that we have to lean into the shadow, to prioritize the shadow and what it has rather than what the ego wants. And that is, if someone can accomplish that, then they are truly blessed, because that is a difficult thing. But I think that's exactly what, like, moments like this, like with the eclipses, this is exactly what they're trying to teach us and encourage, is that flexibility.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's really hard for people is knowing how to do that, because
Yeah.
a lot of times when we meet the shadow, we are not like, well, like we're not feeling great. It's
Yeah.
not really the time where we're pulling out the old journal and being
Mm-mm.
like, I'm going to figure out where this is coming from. But if you have the ability, if you're listening to this right now and you're kind of in a dark night of the soul kind of moment, that is, you can hear us talking about this then. And, my tip would be to actually lean into the fucked up things that you're feeling, but ask them questions. Like ask
Mm-hmm.
the hard feeling. Obviously, what's causing the hard feeling, because there's probably a circumstance or a
Yeah.
heartache or a failure or a loss that's really upsetting to you. But then what is even deeper than that is what, and what is even further deeper underneath that, right? Like we have to do that literal excavation work of going down into the underworld of our own psychology, not even the psyche, just like our mind and our connection to our circumstances, and say, where does this feeling of despair come from? Why do I not believe that the sun is ever going to come back again? And, how can I meet that and how can I soothe it? I think is a really important set of questions to be able to ask and answer. And you might have to ask a few times. I think sometimes when we ask ourselves questions in automatic writing or active imagination or journaling, we come up short, and we even might make ourselves angry because there's a part of ourselves that doesn't want to give over to the conversation and doesn't want to answer the questions and just wants to be in the wound, and that's okay too. But if we're looking for ways to alchemize this, then we have to kind of push on it a little bit. And I think that in terms of like Jung's ideas on alchemy and, the sort of like process of individuation, the dark night of the soul is connected to the nigredo phase, which is the
Mm-hmm.
first phase, which is the blackening,
Mm-hmm.
where we kind of stick the item we're trying to alchemize into the pot and we burn it to a crisp. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that's symbolic, obviously, of maybe us feeling like we're charred to bits by our
Yeah.
life circumstances, but also, you know, like heating up and engaging and pressurizing and cooking the idea of, the fear, the shadow, the narrative of failure until we reduce it to its most essential components. And then what is it next? The albedo, right? The
Yeah.
whitening,
Yep.
which comes in, where we actually start to kind of cultivate a sense of relief, and we bring the light
Yep.
back in to
Yep.
guide us towards the next phase where we kind of begin that individuation process. But all of that to say, I think that it's good to talk about, the shadow and the shed, but how do people actually make use of these ideas?
Mm-hmm.
I think is important to sit with. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, those are some tips, I think. Do you have any other ideas
Yeah.
around that stuff?
I think using alchemy is excellent. In a lot of my tarot classes, I teach shadow work. You can't see me if you're listening to this, but I have a
She's doing
huge
air
air
quotes,
quotes.
everyone.
Shadow work. Because everything is shadow work. So it's just like, this is why it's so silly to me, because it's like, what the hell isn't shadow work? If you're if you are like really struggling with anything, you're doing shadow work. But alchemy, Jung used those 4 stages of alchemy. There's a lot of different stages of alchemy, and a lot of different alchemists have different
Yeah.
things of these stages. But Jung reduced it to 4, which is, it works, it fits. And he said that these are the stages of individuation. I think more appropriately, these are the stage. I mean, I think that one way of interpreting them is as the stages of shadow work,
Mhm.
being the impetus for individuation, like 9 times out of 10.
Mhm.
In which, as you said, we have that nigredo, the blackening, then we have the albedo, the whitening, then we have the citrinitas, the yellowing, and then we have the rubedo, the reddening. And the way that the words that Jung associated with these stages were confession, elucidation, education, and transformation. And I think when we think of this process in a practical way, it's exactly how it goes. It takes a long time. This is not instantaneous, but we begin with the confession, which is the sort of Inanna thing of taking off the clothes, right? Like shedding the thing. Like, here is the thing. I've taken it off. I'm looking at it. Then we go through the that elucidation, that bringing light in again. So it's not really a stage of understanding as much as it is a stage of like purification, of like trying to cleanse ourselves of whatever suffering comes with it, or pain comes with it, or shame comes with it, or whatever. From that place, after we've kind of cleansed out that darkness from it a little bit, we can engage in that education phase, in which we try to understand, how did we get here? What is this part of me? What does it tell me about myself? How did it develop? We can interrogate it a little bit with the intention of understanding it, and intellectually understanding it and emotionally understanding it. And then when we have fully understood it to the best of our ability, then we have the transformation, because then all of a sudden our ego is participating with this thing rather than it being hidden in the dark. So an example might be that we might say, oh, I'm really, mean to my boyfriend or whatever, and say, okay, well, that's a confession. I have to face this fact in me. I have to shed this thing that I've always said of like, well, like, he's mean to me first or whatever. I have to look at this part of me. Then we bring that elucidation and we say, okay, I'm going to trust that there's meaning in this for me, and there's something to learn here. And I'm going to kind of detach myself from the suffering or pain and shame. Then we're going to ask questions about it. Like, why do I do that? What's the thing that makes me want to do that? Do I do that when he says something like such and such to me? Or do I do that when I feel scared or I feel unloved? Like, what is the thing behind it that causes that action? As you're saying, like asking the questions. And that is such a huge part of any of this sort of work, is just asking as many questions as possible and not needing the answer to be something, which is really hard, but trying to be receptive and curious about the answer. And then from asking these questions, you might learn something like, okay, well, yeah, I'm really scared he's going to reject me. right? And so like there's like this defense mechanism that comes in that's like, oh, he's going to reject me or he's going to hurt my feelings in some way, which I'm scared I won't be able to handle. And so I lash out first, or I act in this way. And then we have understanding about it. The next time we get into that moment where that's what the shadow is going to naturally do, all of a sudden there is this understanding. There's this rubedo moment of like, I can choose something else right now. Actually, I can do something else here in this experience. And there's that transformation point. And so I think that when we're working with anything, and of course that's like a more like personal shadow thing, but even if we're working with loss or grief or something that happens on the outside of us, we can bring it into that same process of that confession, elucidation, education, transformation. And I say all of that with like a lot of many grains of salt, because like when we're inside of it, we're not going to think of it that way. But if we need a framework to remind ourselves, as you said, map helps. If we need, that's a really good map for us of like, where am I on this process? Am I in that process of just confession right now, or I got a little ways to go? Maybe I want to lean into that elucidation if I can, or try to bring some light to this, or shed some of this intensity, or whatever it might be. Am I in the education stage? Okay, I gotta take that seriously, and I gotta learn as much as I can about this so that I can bring conscious change. So I think that can help, and that's something that great to use with the cards in particular. Whenever you have a card that comes up that seems to speak to something shadowy, that's a really good time to kind of bring it into that process and like work with it in that intentional way. The card can be like a mediating symbol for that.
So interesting. So I think that we're lucky to have the tools that we have at this time. Like we've had this kind of boom in not just like witchy things, but in approaches to understanding self that are really nuanced. And
Yeah.
my hope is that, for those of you tuning in during this eclipse time or catching up with us later, that the idea of what it is to be eclipsed, or what it is to go down into the underworld, right? Like so many characters do. Aeneas, Hercules, Psyche, Persephone, Hermes, all the time. Like there's just all of these, Inanna, all of these characters that go down and come back up. You too will go down and you will come back up. And so I hope that this conversation has kind of given people good other reminders that there is like a path, and there is that sort of map that we can pull from stories. It's really important.
Something that you might want to do on the eclipse or in between these eclipses is to read St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul poem. That is the origination of that phrase.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it is from a poem, 16th century, 16th, 17th, 16th, I don't know, one of those century. He was a Spanish mystic, and it is not a poem of grief, even though he is lost in the dark. He has nothing, no light, no lamp, nothing, and he is wandering. It is a poem of ecstatic bliss, because he is certain that he follows what he calls the burning in his heart, which is telling him there that he was a monk, so he's telling him that God is there, and he's going to find that. And I think that is, I think about that poem when I like talk about the moon card sometimes, which is also like a dark night of the soul experience for us. And the moon is active doing stuff right now. So maybe if you want a little bit of some old poetry to give you some inspiration about how to maintain the burning in the heart and know that you're seeking God and seeking self, right? That might be a nice little thing to read.
Sounds great. I love that.
Yeah, great. Okay, on to a dream. If you're enjoying this podcast, we encourage you to leave a review or learn more about how you can support us on Mighty Networks, where you can get access to some exciting exclusive offerings. Or you can connect with us by sharing a symbolic experience, whether from a dream or synchronicity, for us to explore on the show. Thank you to today's sharer, and please tell us your symbolic experience or connect with us on our website, sorormysticapodcast.com.
Are you a small business looking to reach a targeted audience of people interested in all things esoteric? If this sounds like you, Soror Mystica would love to invite you to become an ad partner. We offer a highly tailored audience of mindful, curious, depth-seeking listeners, and we would be delighted to showcase your business and offerings to new hearts and new minds. Simply fill out an advertiser application form at our website, linked in the show notes below, or navigate to sorormysticapodcast.com/advertise with us.
So this dream says, in many of my dreams, I'm always having trouble keeping my feet on the ground and not able to stop myself from floating up to the sky, and eventually I give up and start flying around. If I try to hold on to something on the ground to keep me from floating up, my feet will float up over my head. What does this floating up mean? So it's a classic dream symbol. And there's like so many ways that we could go with floating. And if you Google flying or floating or whatever in dreams, like Google's going to give you 10,000 different things out there. So there's a lot of information, but I want to know what you kind of think about with floating or flying dreams.
Yeah, I mean, in contrast with like our descent
Yeah.
conversation today, now we have a rising that won't
Mm-hmm.
stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously there's some kind of, you know, imbalance in this person's psyche between gravity and being pulled upwards. But it seems to me like the idea of floating up, and even so much so that your feet float above your head, is like something is trying to get your attention and make you look up rather
Mm.
than look down. And
Mm-hmm.
so, being like, what does it mean to be pulled up
Yeah.
into the higher
Like you're
registers of
trying to stay
consciousness?
grounded, but
Yeah,
there's a pulling upward. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Like the person is grounded. They're trying to fight the ascension moment, which sounds like you're being like abducted, but you're not. I think that it's part of the psyche tugging on this person and being like, look up. We have a lot to look
Mm-hmm.
up towards, or there's something
Mm-hmm.
that we haven't seen yet that is up. We've done the earthly grounded thing, and it's time to kind of, rise into the next field, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my very cursory read,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah,
Yeah.
what comes to mind for you?
I think that's a great starting point. First of all, I would tell this person to watch The Curse. And I
Mm.
don't want to spoil anything. But there is the idea of floating ends up being something very important in the TV show. It's a TV show, and I think it might be a very interesting thing for you to watch to get. I can't say anything because I don't want to give any spoilers, but I think it might be really stimulating to kind of see, because the show is basically uses the idea of floating as a very poignant symbol to make make its statement about what the condition of humanity and how we live our lives, etc. So just go watch that. See if that gives you anything. I can't say anything more. But I think that, when we think about floating, I totally agree with you. There's like a new orientation. There's like a flip of where we're looking, where we're paying attention. There's a flip of gravity. So the gravity is being pulled into the heavens, the ether, right, rather than being on Earth. So a very basic thing would be that I would ask if you feel somewhat ungrounded
Hmm.
right now. Like, is there a part of your psyche that is really desperate to feel like I need to like be here, steady? Like I need something sturdy underneath me. That might be a very just basic thing to start considering, is like, how do I create a little bit more structure for myself? But such an intense dream and having it repeatedly, there's obviously something more than just like, okay, be grounded. I would say that, one of the things that we associate with flying dreams is like freedom, like a ability to rise above the conditions of life, which keep us maybe limited or stuck, or we don't have as much power there. But floating feels a little bit different to me. It feels scarier
Hmm.
than it feels liberating. Um, and so I would wonder if there is like, absolutely, if we think about Greek mythology, anytime we have ideas of floating, flying, whatever, we're talking about if inflation,
Hmm.
where it's like we are superseding the rightful place of where our feet should be, and we're going into the realm of the gods. And so we're too high. And so we know we're going to probably have our wings melt and fall down, or have our chariot blow up, or whatever is going to happen, and we're going to crash. So there is always a question with these sorts of dreams of like feeling inflated, meaning that the ego is like over expanding its natural boundaries of saying like, it's overestimating its importance and feeling very, I don't know, it's a good way of thinking about it. It's feeling much bigger and much just like a narcissistic quality to the ego at that point when it's inflated, which is natural. It's a natural thing we have to do. I think Edward Edinger, I think it's him who says that the ego has to inflate itself at points in order to rise above its limited understanding of what it is. So sometimes it has to like bloat itself, push forward in order to see its new boundaries. But yeah, when we think about floating and flying, we can also think about that idea of like rising above the natural kind of place the ego should be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like the opposite of what I was saying, where I'm
Yeah.
like, it's okay.
I mean, but I don't know. It could be either. Like
Mm-hmm.
the fact that the person is scared of this and
Mm-hmm.
trying to stay on Earth is interesting. Like if it was more of an inflation kind of thing, I would imagine that the ego is like looking to fly, right?
Yeah.
It would be like,
Mm-hmm.
let's go.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's like, I think that what is speaking to me about it is that the force, like the supernatural forces of the dream, are pulling this person into a new register of experience, and they're
Mm-hmm.
fighting it. And so kind of like, um I don't know, just at any turning point in our lives, like I'm curious about what is up for this person right now. Are they at a crossroads? Are they
Mm-hmm.
trying to make a decision? Are they trying to whatever, change careers, break up with someone, whatever's
Mm-hmm.
going on? And what about that scares them? And I think that the dream says, like, if we think about floating to me implies a kind of weightlessness.
Yeah.
And that's something that we all kind of want, right? We don't want to feel burdened by
Mm-hmm.
the world. Of course, if you float away too high and too fast, like Icarus or Phaethon, you crash and burn, and that's not what we want. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that it almost feels more like an invitation, or like something is beckoning you playfully to be floating and floaty, than to be, being like subsumed
Mm-hmm.
by some kind of sun god who's going to devour you up.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that it feels like there's a change in register in this person's
Yeah.
psychic life. And the dream is pointing that out and saying maybe it's okay to experiment with exploring it and seeing what that does.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um,
I would
oh,
definitely
yeah.
recommend like if there's any possibility for like engaging in the dream to see if you can let yourself go
Yeah.
into the space, see what happens.
That's literally what I was just going to say. This
Mm-hmm.
seems like a great opportunity for some experimentation with lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
And if you can get into a space where you're aware that you're dreaming, and then like do something with that float that feels empowering or that feels beautiful or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that could change the quality of whatever anxiety kind of circles in the dream for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing this dream. Thanks for hanging out with us as we talked about eclipses. Good luck, everybody, through this eclipse moment.
Hmm. It's on my
And
sun. I'm being eclipsed right now.
oh, good. That's great. Are you going to survive? Are
I
you going
think
to make it?
well, actually, I'm not going to say anything. No.
We don't know. Leave it open ended. Um, well, and just stay flexible,
Hmm.
and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for joining us in our conversation today.
Please consider supporting the podcast by leaving a review and following Soror Mystica wherever you listen.
You can also become a more active supporter and a member of the Soror Mystica community by joining us on our Mighty Networks platform.
If you have a symbolic experience that you'd like to share with us for the podcast, you can tell us all about it at sorormysticapodcast.com.
The music for this podcast is written and performed by me, Mariana Lewis, with special thanks to Stefan Lewis. You can connect with both Christina and myself on Instagram and get to know our work by clicking on the links in the show notes.
As the alchemical motto goes, as above, so below, as within, so without.
May this ancient wisdom continue to guide you deeper.
Until next time, take good care.